There is a specific kind of darkness that settles over a city when the sun goes down. A darkness that is amplified not by silence, but by the rhythmic, mechanical roar of industry and transit. In the northeast corner of Philadelphia, there is a steel artery known as the Market-Frankford line, or simply the L. For decades, the elevated train has rumbled over Frankford Avenue, casting long, strobing shadows onto the streets below. It is a place of blue-collar pride, of row homes and neighborhood taverns, where generations of families have lived and died within the same few blocks. But in the latter half of the 1980s, those shadows beneath the L became the hunting ground for a phantom. This was a predator who stalked the night with impunity, targeting women in a frenzy of violence that left a community paralyzed with fear and a police force grasping at straws. They called him the Frankford Slasher. He is perhaps the most notorious serial killer you have never heard the full story of. A ghost who may have walked away into the mist while another man died in prison for his crimes. Welcome to DCF Investigations. Today, we are descending into the gritty streets of 1980s Philadelphia to unravel a tangled web of murder, potential wrongful conviction, and a mystery that remains as cold as the steel tracks of the L. To understand the horror that gripped this neighborhood, we must first understand the atmosphere of Frankford in 1985. This was not the polished, gentrified city center. This was a working-class stronghold, a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. It was a neighborhood of corner delis, fish markets, and dive bars where the same patrons sat on the same stools every night. But beneath the veneer of neighborhood camaraderie, the economic downturn of the 80s was taking its toll. Substance abuse was creeping in, and the cracks in the social fabric were beginning to show. It was in this environment of fraying edges that the killer found his opportunity. He did not target the high-profile socialites of the city. He targeted the women of Frankford, women who were often vulnerable, women who frequented the bars along the avenue, women who, in the eyes of a cynical society, might have been considered easy targets. The nightmare began on August 19th, 1985. And the summer heat in Philadelphia is often oppressive, a humid blanket that traps the exhaust of the city against the pavement. Helen Patent was 52 years old. She was a woman who had known struggle. Living in the shadow of the L, she was known to frequent the local establishments, seeking company and perhaps a momentary escape from the hardships of her daily life. On that sweltering August day, Helen had been seen at a local bar, a place where the jukebox played old hits and the air smelled of stale beer and cigarettes. She left the bar, likely intending to head home, or perhaps to another establishment, but she never made it. Her body was discovered behind a warehouse on Paul Street, a desolate stretch of concrete hidden from the main thoroughfare. But the brutality of the attack on Helen Patent shocked even the hardened detectives of the Philadelphia Police Department. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times, but the signature of the killer was already evident. Her throat had been slashed with a terrifying precision. At the time, with no pattern yet established, the police treated it as an isolated incident. Perhaps a robbery gone wrong or a domestic dispute that had spilled into the streets. There was no DNA profiling, as we know it today, to instantly link a suspect to a crime scene. Fingerprinting and blood typing were the primary tools, and in an alleyway littered with the debris of the city, physical evidence was difficult to isolate. Helen Patton became a file on a desk, a tragedy for her family, but not yet a signal of a coming storm, and the neighborhood of Frankford exhaled, hoping that the violence was an anomaly. But the winter of 1985 would bring a chilling realization that something far darker was at play. As the holidays approached and the temperature dropped, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was 68-year-old Anna Carroll. Anna was different from the profile the police might have been building in their minds. She was not a woman who spent her nights in the bars along the avenue. She was a grandmother, a woman described by her neighbors as kind, pious, and safe. On January 3rd, 1986, she was found in her own apartment. The sanctuary of the home had been violated. The scene inside Anna Carroll's apartment was a tableau of horror that mirrored the death of Helen Patton. She had been stabbed, sexually assaulted, and her throat had been slashed. The killer had left her positioned in a way that suggested a deep, seething hatred for women. The fact that he had entered a home rather than attacking in a dark alley signaled an escalation. It suggested a predator who was growing bolder, one who felt comfortable enough in the neighborhood to navigate its streets and its structures without fear of detection. The community began to whisper. The connection between the two murders was not officially confirmed by the police immediately, as they were wary of causing a panic. But the residents of Frankford knew. They knew that the same hand that took Helen Patton had taken Anna Carroll. For nearly a year, the streets remained relatively quiet, a tense silence that hung over Frankford like a held breath. Then, in October of 1986, the slasher returned. Frida Waldsee was 64 years old, a retired woman who lived a quiet life. Like Anna Carroll, she was not a bar patron. She was a woman with medical issues, vulnerable and frail. Her body was discovered near the train tracks, that ever-present symbol of the neighborhood. The violence inflicted upon her was consistent with the previous attacks. The slashing of the throat, the sexual assault, the sheer overkill. By now, the Philadelphia Police Department could no longer deny the reality. They were hunting a serial killer. A task force was assembled, patrols were increased along Frankford Avenue, and the media began to descend. The moniker, the Frankford Slasher, was plastered across newspapers and flashed on television screens, instilling a primal fear in every woman who lived in the zip code. And the investigation in the late 80s was hampered by the limitations of the era. There were no surveillance cameras on every corner, no cell phone location data to track the movements of victims and suspects. Detectives had to rely on old-fashioned shoe-leather policing. They canvassed the bars, interviewing bartenders and patrons, showing photos, and taking notes on index cards. They were looking for a ghost. Witness descriptions were vague and often contradictory, but a profile began to emerge. Witnesses spoke of a white male, middle-aged, perhaps in his 40s or 50s, often seen wearing a beige or tan jacket. He was described as looking like a regular guy, someone who blended in, someone who could sit on a bar stool next to you and not raise a single alarm until it was too late. And this man in the white jacket became the specter of Frankford. The year 1987 would prove to be the most devastating year of the slasher's reign. In January, the body of 55-year-old Marianne Carr was found. Marianne broke the mold of the typical victim in one significant way. She was a nurse, a professional woman, younger than the previous victims. She had been out with friends at a club called Kurt's, a popular spot on Frankford Avenue. She left the bar alone, a decision that many women made every night without consequence. But on this night, the slasher was watching. Her body was found at a truck stop, miles away from where she was last seen. But the cause of death was unmistakably the work of the Frankford Slasher. The change in disposal site suggested the killer had access to a vehicle, adding another layer of complexity to the profile. The community was at a breaking point. Vigilante groups began to form, with local men patrolling the streets with baseball bats and flashlights. Women refused to walk alone, even during the day. The police were under immense pressure to produce a suspect. Every registered sex offender in the area was questioned. Every drifter was stopped and frisked. But the slasher continued his work with a terrifying arrogance. In March of 1987, Teresa Sciortino, aged 30, was found dead in her home. Teresa's case was particularly heartbreaking. She was discovered by her own mother. The killer had once again entered a residence, showing that locks and doors were no barrier to his compulsion. Teresa had been deceased for several days before she was found, and the scene was gruesome. The level of violence was escalating, if such a thing were possible. The rage evident in the wounds suggested a killer who was unraveling, whose need to destroy was becoming more urgent and more chaotic. The police were desperate. They needed a break. They needed a name. And in the midst of this desperation, the investigation took a turn that remains controversial to this day. Throughout the spree, the composite sketches and witness descriptions consistently pointed to a white male. This was a crucial detail in a neighborhood that, while diverse, had distinct racial demographics in certain pockets. The killer was believed to be a local, a white man who fit into the tapestry of the Frankford bar scene. Then came the murder of Carol Dowd. It was April 29th, 1990. Carol Dowd, 46 years old, was a regular at the fish markets and shops along the avenue. Her body was found in the alleyway behind a fish market, a place she was known to frequent. Her throat had been slashed. But this time, the timeline of the investigation shifted rapidly. A witness came forward, claiming to have seen Carol Dowd shortly before her death in the company of a man. But this man did not fit the description of the phantom white male that had haunted the investigation for 5 years. The man seen with Carol Dowd was Leonard Christopher, a black man who worked at a local fish market. Leonard Christopher was not a ghost. He was a known entity in the neighborhood, a man with a job. A man who did not match the physical profile that detectives had been building for half a decade. He was brought in for questioning. Christopher maintained his innocence from the very beginning. He admitted to knowing Carol Dowd, admitted to seeing her, but denied harming her. The police, however, were under catastrophic pressure to close the case. The media frenzy was deafening. The city demanded a culprit. The case against Leonard Christopher was circumstantial at best. There was no physical evidence linking him to the murder of Carol Dowd. No blood on his clothes. No murder weapon found in his possession. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of a witness who placed him with Dowd and the fact that he was in the vicinity. But the most glaring issue was the discrepancy with the other murders. Leonard Christopher was a black man. The Frankford Slasher had been consistently described by multiple witnesses across multiple crime scenes as a white man. To circumvent this massive contradiction, the prosecution made a strategic decision. They did not try Leonard Christopher for all the murders attributed to the Frankford Slasher. They tried him only for the murder of Carol Dowd. However, the implication hung heavy in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. By arresting Christopher, the police were effectively signaling that they had caught the slasher, even if they couldn't legally pin the other crimes on him. They floated the theory that perhaps Christopher had an accomplice, a white man, and that they had been killing together. This duo theory was a convenient way to explain away the racial discrepancy, but there was virtually no evidence to support it. No accomplice was ever named. No white partner was ever charged. During the trial, the defense argued vehemently that Christopher was a scapegoat, a convenient target for a police force desperate to clear their books. They pointed to the lack of forensic evidence. They pointed to the fact that Christopher did not drive, making the transport of Mary Ann Carr's body to a distant truck stop impossible for him to have accomplished alone. They pointed to the fact that during some of the previous murders, Christopher had verifiable alibis or was working. But the jury, perhaps swayed by the fear gripping the city and the need for closure, convicted Leonard Christopher of the murder of Carol Dowd. He was sentenced to life in prison. The authorities breathed a sigh of relief. The newspapers ran headlines declaring the nightmare over. But the story of the Frankford Slasher does not end with the incarceration of Leonard Christopher. In fact, this is where the story becomes truly disturbing. While Leonard Christopher sat in a prison cell, the killings did not stop. On September 6th, 1990, just months after Christopher's arrest, 30-year-old Michelle DeJesus was found murdered. She had been stabbed and slashed in a manner eerily similar to the previous victims. She was found in Frankford. The community was stunned. If the killer was behind bars, who killed Michelle DeJesus? The police were quick to label this a copycat crime. They argued that the details of the slasher's methods had been publicized enough that someone else was mimicking him. It was a plausible theory. But to the residents of Frankford, it felt like a dismissal, and it felt like the authorities were refusing to admit they might have the wrong man. Then came Margaret Vaughn. In 1993, years after Christopher was put away, 66-year-old Margaret Vaughn was found dead. The circumstances were chillingly familiar. A vulnerable woman, an attack in the Frankfurt area, the slashing wounds. Again, the specter of the slasher loomed. By this time, the official task force had long been disbanded. The Frankford Slasher was officially considered a closed chapter, with the conviction of Christopher. These new murders were treated as separate incidents, unconnected to the reign of terror between 1985 and 1990. But for the families of the victims and the people of the neighborhood, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. Let us dive deeper into the profile of the alternate suspect, the man who was never caught. Throughout the investigation, there was a persistent rumor, a whisper that grew into a roar in the local bars. The man in the white jacket. Witnesses had described him as having a pockmarked face, perhaps wearing glasses, with a distinct shambling gait. There were reports of a man who worked in the meatpacking industry, someone skilled with knives, someone who knew how to make the specific types of cuts found on the victims. One particular suspect, known only by a pseudonym in many files to protect his identity as he was never charged, was a local man who lived with his mother. He fit the physical description perfectly: white, middle-aged, socially awkward, and known to wander the streets of Frankfurt at night, and he was reportedly interviewed by police early in the investigation. Some investigators believed he was the true killer. He had been seen in the bars where the victims drank. He lived in the epicenter of the killing zone, but for reasons that remain murky, perhaps a lack of definitive physical evidence, perhaps political pressure to stick with the Christopher conviction, this suspect was never arrested. He died a free man years later, taking his secrets to the grave. There is also the forensic tragedy of the case. In the mid-'80s and early '90s, DNA technology was in its infancy. The biological samples collected from the early scenes were often degraded or preserved improperly by modern standards. When DNA testing eventually became available, attempts were made to test evidence from the Frankford Slasher cases. In some instances, the evidence had been lost or destroyed, a common occurrence in cold cases from that era. In the case of Carol Dowd, the murder for which Christopher was convicted, later analysis of semen found on her clothing did not match Leonard Christopher. It matched a different blood type, a different profile. Yet, the legal system is a slow-moving beast. Christopher remained in prison, his appeals denied. The system unwilling to overturn a conviction that had brought a sense of peace, however false, to the city. Leonard Christopher died in prison. He maintained his innocence until his final breath. If he was indeed innocent, then two tragedies occurred. An innocent man lost his life to the machinery of the state, and a monster was allowed to walk free, potentially claiming more lives like Michelle DeJesus and Margaret Vaughn, while the police looked the other way. The legacy of the Frankford Slasher is a wound that has never fully healed in Northeast Philadelphia. Walk down Frankford Avenue today, and the L still rumbles overhead, drowning out conversations just as it did in 1985. The neighborhood has changed. New businesses have opened, populations have shifted, but the older residents still remember. They remember the fear of those winters. They remember the way the street lights seemed a little dimmer, the shadows a little longer. We must also consider the victims, whose lives are often overshadowed by the mystery of the killer. Helen Patent, a mother struggling to find her way. Anna Carroll, a gentle soul whose faith was her bedrock. Frida Valzi, Marianne Carr, Teresa Ciortino, Carol Dowd, Michelle DeJesus, Margaret Vaughn. Oh, these were not just names on a police blotter. They were women with families, with histories, with futures that were stolen in moments of sheer, unadulterated terror. They were the lifeblood of their community. The system failed them twice. First, by failing to protect them, and second, by potentially failing to bring their true killer to justice. The theory of the Frankford Slasher, being a single individual, is the most widely accepted. But we must also acknowledge the possibility of multiple predators operating in the same ecosystem of neglect. Frankfurt in the '80s was a place where crime could hide in plain sight. Is it possible that Leonard Christopher killed Carol Dowd, while another man killed the others? It is a possibility, though the modus operandi was strikingly similar across the board. Through the slashing of the throat is a very specific, intimate, and hateful method of killing. It is not the method of a robber or casual criminal. It is the mark of a serial sexual sadist. The likelihood of two such specific killers operating in the same few square miles at the same time, targeting the same demographic, is statistically improbable. The most chilling aspect of this case is the silence that followed. After the murder of Margaret Vaughn in 1993, the slasher-style killings seemed to cease. Did the killer die? Did he move to another city, another state, to continue his work in a place where no one knew to look for the man in the white jacket? Or did he simply age out, his urges dampening as his body grew too old to overpower his victims? There is a theory in criminology that serial killers do not simply stop unless they are dead or incarcerated. If the true Frankford Slasher was not Leonard Christopher, then he likely lived among the people of Philadelphia for years, perhaps standing in line at the grocery store, perhaps sitting on a park bench, watching the world go by, holding the memory of his atrocities like a dark, secret treasure. Today, the case remains officially solved in the eyes of the bureaucracy regarding Carol Dowd, but open and cold for the others. Cold case detectives occasionally dust off the files, looking for a stray hair or a forgotten slide that could be subjected to advanced DNA phenotyping or genealogical database searches. But as the decades pass, the window for justice narrows. Witnesses die, memories fade, and evidence degrades. And the Frankford Slasher case stands as a stark reminder of the limitations of justice, the dangers of tunnel vision in police work, and the vulnerability of marginalized communities. We are left with a haunting picture: the grainy black and white photographs of the crime scenes, the sketches of a man with dead eyes and a beige jacket, and the towering steel structure of the L, witnessing it all, but saying nothing. The screams of the victims were swallowed by the roar of the train, and their stories were swallowed by a system that prioritized a conviction over the truth. As we conclude this deep dive, I want you to think about the man in the white jacket. Think about the possibility that he watched the news reports of Leonard Christopher's trial, perhaps with a sense of relief, perhaps with a sense of scorn. Think about the secrets buried in the soil of Frankford. This has been a DCF investigation. We shine a light where others look away. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Leonard Christopher was an innocent scapegoat? And if so, do you think the true Frankford Slasher took his secrets to the grave? Or is he still out there, an old man watching the trains go by? Stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop asking questions.